Right, well, good evening, everybody. Very warm welcome to you all. It's great to see so many of you here. My name is Fraser Mitchell. I'm the head of the School of Natural Sciences, and I have to start with an apology from our dean, Vinnie Cahill, who should be standing here. Vinnie's actually tied up in an interview session. We're appointing some new staff, which is always very exciting, but unfortunately that has gone on rather longer than planned, so he will be joining us, so I just offer his apologies. But we are here to celebrate a new chair in the school. It's always very exciting, these inaugural events where we welcome a new chair into a position, in this case the chair of Zoology, which was established in 1871. And so Yvonne Buckley has had quite a lot of precursors that have held this role, and it's absolutely wonderful to be able to welcome Yvonne at an event like this where we basically she has a public outing to the college community and to her friends and family and others, so it is fantastic. And in a way for Yvonne it's a bit of a homecoming, because Yvonne hails from Kanturk in North Cork, and when she left school she went to university in Oxford, and from there went on to Imperial College in London to do a PhD. And after that she worked there as a research scientist for a while before going all the way down to Australia to the University of Queensland in Brisbane. And she's now done the return circuit. And so she really has travelled the globe. And I think that's highly relevant to her research, which really is ecology, and it's now of very significant global consequence, what she does. We have a concern about our little planet, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, and she will as well, obviously, as well. But she is an ecologist. Ecologists study the interaction of organisms and their environment, and she studies both plants and animals, which is highly relevant to study both sorts of organisms. And she is a very productive researcher. She is of global significance, her research. And her group, she was appointed here just 2 years ago. And within that 2 years, her group has published 7 papers in the leading international journals of science and nature, which is an amazing accomplishment. I'm not going to bamboozle you with lots of metrics. I think that one speaks for itself. And it shows that her research is of great significance, and an awful lot of people want to learn more about it, and that's important. But also, an academic career isn't just research. And particularly in this university, we jump around a triangle of 3 activities of research, teaching, and administration. And some people tend to be quite good at one of them. Often we try to get near the middle, but Yvonne actually has got a foot in each of those 3 corners of that triangle, because not only is she an excellent researcher, I do some teaching with Yvonne, and I can attest that she is actually a really inspirational teacher. She is a fantastic teacher. I think we'll get a hint of that this evening. And also she is a very efficient and very well-respected administrator, so she does all these tasks. And she also has brought a lot of academic leadership to our school and to the university. She's been heavily involved in developing some of the research themes for the university for the next period of our strategic plan. She's also been heavily involved in the development of a new institute where we're going to try and bring together several schools to study environmental issues as well. But her role in research is really what tonight is about, and we're going to hear more about that. And I suppose ecology has really come of age to a certain extent. There are a lot of global issues that we're concerned about, and ecologists have been harping on about this for generations. But they're being listened to now. And I think that's an indication of the mess we've made of our little planet, and the realization this is the only planet we've got to live on, and if we don't look after it, we're going to have severe problems. And some of these problems have started happening already. And so it's people like Yvonne that are doing the research that really are of global consequence, and people are looking to her. And so she's really addressing one of the most pressing and urgent issues, I think, that humanity actually faces. So I'm really absolutely delighted that Yvonne is holding this post as the chair of Zoology, and she's going to lead the way in many respects. So I'm going to hand over to her to give her talk, and we'll have some time for some questions afterwards. So thank you, Yvonne.
Thank you all very much, and thank you so much to Fraser for those kind words. It really is a great honour to be here, so I welcome you all, the provost, my parents, my family, my primary school teacher, colleagues from Trinity, colleagues from other universities in Ireland. I've even got a friend who's visiting from Brisbane who came specially for my lecture, she told me. So it better be good. And if you hear heckling from the back, my kids are here as well. So hi, Sam and Maeve. They're under strict instructions to be as quiet as possible. And Fiona kindly gave them some colouring books before the start of the lecture, so that should entertain them. So I'm going to kick off by showing this beautiful photograph taken by my mother, and it sort of illustrates the problems, the issues that Fraser alluded to. So we live on this planet, and humans have been changing the planet so fundamentally and so entirely that we've now entered into what some scientists think is a new geological epoch, the Anthropocene, an epoch dominated by human influence on the planet. We've changed our landscapes, we're changing our rocks, we've moved mountains, we've altered the climate, we've put water where water has never been before, and we've taken water from places where it's always occurred. We move species around the planet at an incredible rate. So we're mixing ecosystems, we're creating these new habitats and these new collections of species which have never occurred together before in history. So as an ecologist, I'm absolutely fascinated by these changes. As a citizen, I worry about the impacts that these changes will have on my lifetime and on the generations to come. And that's what drives my research, is a real intellectual hunger to understand what's going on, and a really strong need to understand those impacts and also to manage those impacts, to see how we as society can change the planet for the better, how we can design the ecosystems that we're going to live in rather than have them happen to us by accident. So now on to the important things of life. This is a really nice infographic done by the Irish Forum for Natural Capital, which illustrates this concept of natural capital. So natural capital is the living things, the rocks, the atmosphere that we rely on for our survival and well-being. So in your pint of beer, which I hope you'll be partaking of later, lesser-known ingredients include mountains, forests, bogs, oceans, and all living things. So in order to make this beer, we need water. Now, the water in a pint of Guinness comes from the Wicklow Mountains. It's very low mineral content. It gets filtered through the bogs there, so they're providing us with a tremendous service by storing this water and letting it out slowly in a lovely filtered, clean state, making Guinness taste so distinctive. The biodiversity that goes into a pint includes hops, yeast, barley, and in order to grow the things like barley, we need climate and nutrient regulation, water regulation going on underlying all these things. So our planet does a lot for us. And in this one simple product, you can see the complexity, the ecological complexity that goes into making something as simple as a pint of beer. So I've covered beer, now I'll move on to whiskey. This is a field trip that I took my research lab on a couple of weeks ago. We decided to go to our local distillery here in Dublin. And while we were there, I got to thinking about technology. So here we can see the distilling going on here of the whiskey behind us. So turning things like grains into spirit, which then gets stored in barrels, and it takes on the color and the chemicals that come from the wood in the barrels. So it's a really interesting process. We learned a lot. But it got me thinking about what technology is. And technology is formally defined, I guess, one of its definitions is the science of craft. So it's the science of how we do things, how we make things, how we change things, how we design things. This is the science of doing, and this is what I love to do. I love to not just learn about things, but work out how we can apply the things that we learn. We seem to be quite comfortable with the use of technology to produce a relatively simple product from these simple ingredients, but we don't tend to label as technology the know-how, the knowledge, the methods that we use to manage more complex ecosystems. So I actually got to thinking that what I do in the design of management of ecosystems is technology. So what I do is I consider natural capital, which is the things that the planet provides for us, together with social capital, that's us as humans, what we do, what we know, how we operate, our built capital, the environments that we create around ourselves that enable us to survive and live well on the planet, and our technological capital, our know-how. We are a technological species. We know how to do an awful lot of things. So how can we harness all of these things to provide for our well-being? So all of these things together, but relying on our natural capital, provide benefits to humans. They provide us with our bacon sandwiches that we have. They provide us with biodiversity, which gives joy to small children and mothers and fathers and families. It provides us with fresh, clean water, opportunities to take in the wonder of nature, these cultural services, as well as the direct provisioning services that we get from food. We also get regulating services, things like the filtering and provision of water through bogs. It's a regulating service. And these cultural services, the pleasure we derive from nature, health benefits. It's been shown increasingly now that biodiversity, living animals and plants and their arrangement in the landscape provides us with massive health benefits. So much so that green prescriptions are being written by doctors, actually recommending that people get out in nature and it will actually be of massive health benefit to them. So we have a lot of complex benefits that we get from this combination of natural capital, social capital, and our technological know-how. A lot of my research has been around managing this natural capital, trying to maximize these benefits and trying to minimize the costs of, for example, pest species. And I've worked a lot on invasive species. These are species which have been taken from one place in the world and transplanted, moved to other places in the world. And sometimes when that happens, things go wrong, species get out of control, and we see negative impacts on our health, our well-being, our economies. So I've been involved in looking at the box in the middle there, the natural capital stocks. So these stocks, if you think of a landscape, it's like a bank. So a landscape or a seascape is a bank. Lodged in this bank is the capital, our investment. This capital is trees in the landscape, it's bogs, it's grasslands, all of these complex ecosystems that provide us with services. Processes like nutrient cycling, water recycling, these are the ecosystem processes that go on within the natural capital. And it includes both the atmosphere and rocks and soils as well as the living components. When we intervene, generally we're changing those stocks. So we're cutting trees down in one place, we're planting them in another place, and we can design landscapes that provide us with benefits. So an agricultural landscape, growing wheat in a field, that's a designed landscape. It's designed to provide us with a single product, wheat, which then gets turned into bread and a number of other products which provide for our well-being and survival. But the more complex problem is how, as humans increase on the face of the planet and our influence spreads into most areas, if not all areas of the planet now, how to get multiple ecosystem benefits from these landscapes that we've typically managed for just one or two benefits. So we're going to need these multifunctional living landscapes in order to get a good standard of living. So these stocks and processes provide us with ecosystem services. So these are the things we get out, and those ultimately lead to benefits for humans. Humans have values, though. For example, when you voted in the general election recently, you would have voted to express your values. So things matter for our well-being. Money matters, obviously. We can't survive and do well on the planet without having the capacity to put a roof over your head, to put food in your children's mouths, to have a decent standard of living. Obviously, money matters to us, and we value it. Health matters to us, we value that. Education matters to us. I can say that standing here in this fine institution of Trinity College Dublin. Education matters to us a lot. Biodiversity matters to us, both directly through the services that we get from nature directly, but also the indirect effects of biodiversity on providing us with money and industries and making our economies work. Our built environment matters to us, the design of that built environment, and we express preferences about where we want to live and how we want to live. Relationships matter to us. So family, friends, colleagues, our social system is incredibly important. So those are our values. Now, our values vary a lot depending on who you are and even what your circumstances are. And we express these values differently. So when you vote, you might be voting because of the economy, or you might be voting because you want to change the health system or the education system or whatever it is that you personally value. But we accept that not everyone's values are the same. So it goes without saying that understanding how to live well on the planet and how to manage it has to take into account these social values in order to get buy-in and get the kind of behavioral change that we need in order to move forward. So one way that we have of dealing with complex ecosystems and complex human societies together is the use of structured decision-making. And this is a way of making decisions that's transparent, that takes into account decision makers, engages them right at the start of the process, and researchers working with decision makers to try and work out exactly what the problem is and what our options are for solving that problem. And the idea is that if we make decisions in this way, it's more transparent, it's repeatable, and if at the end trade-offs are made that we don't agree with, at least we understand what those trade-offs are. So there's several steps to structured decision-making, and this is a technique that I was exposed to in Australia as part of the Australian Research Centre for Excellence in Environmental Decisions, led by my colleague, Professor Hugh Possingham, and it had a huge influence on the way that I go about breaking down problems and trying to work out solutions to these very complex problems. Trinity College Dublin is an international partner of the Centre of Excellence for Environmental Decisions, and we're doing work in this space here, and it would be great to see that increase and continue. So what we do with structured decision-making is we identify the problem, and this is actually can be one of the hardest parts of the whole research project, because decision makers may have an idea of what the problem is, a researcher may have an idea of what the problem is, but only when you get them together and get them talking together can you actually work out exactly what the problem is. Once we have a problem, a well-defined problem, then we define objectives. Okay, so what is it we actually want to achieve here? Then we assess the consequences of those, then we define possible actions. So these are the management interventions we can make, like where do we plant the trees, where do we restore the bogs, how do we manage the grasslands. We assess the consequences of those actions. This is where a lot of my science lies. I look at what effect grazing versus mowing has in grasslands. I look at the effect of fertilization in grasslands. I look at the effect of different ways of reducing population growth rates of pest species. Then we assess the costs and benefits of those actions. There's costs, there's benefits. Sometimes we can assess those in the same currency, and sometimes we can't, and that's another important research problem. And then finally, we have all of the pieces of information, all the pieces of the jigsaw available to us to actually make a decision. And that decision is made by the decision makers. It's not made by the academics. So you can see here how the decision makers are integral to the whole process. Okay. So we've done beer, we've done whiskey. The next most important thing in my view is dessert. So just to illustrate this process and make it a bit more real to you, this is a problem I'm faced with every time I go out to dinner. It's a really tricky question. What will I have for dessert? It's a pretty well-defined question. We define our objectives. So is my objective in having dessert to satisfy my hunger? Am I still hungry and I just need to, fill myself up? Or is it to increase my pleasure at the meal? Or is it just to have something pleasant at the end of the meal? Is it just to extend the amount of time that I'm spending in wonderful company? So that you can have different objectives, and you might have a mix of these objectives. Define possible actions. It's eat creme brulee, eat cheesecake, or eat chocolate. Or ideally, have a tasting plate. Assess the consequences of those actions. Sickness, happiness, fatness. There's going to be trade-offs. We assess the trade-offs between those costs and benefits, and decide whether it's worthwhile and how many desserts to have. And that's where we take our decision. So we don't define it like this, and actually quite often I don't go through this process at all when I'm choosing dessert. I find the best thing to do is flip a coin, and that helps you to make a decision really fast. Because if you flip a coin between two things, and head says have the cheesecake, and tail says have the chocolate, if it comes out according to what you don't actually in your gut want, you'll choose the other thing. It works, it really works. So that's a shortcut. We call that a heuristic. So once you've worked through this very complex process, you may find a nice heuristic which correlates well with the actual optimal answer at the end. So that's what we spend a lot of time doing. Big complex models, and then we try and present a simple decision-making, a way of making decisions. Okay, so believe it or not, I have more complicated problems than choosing dessert to deal with in my day-to-day life. And one of them is, this is just an example of how to manage cats and rats on a beautiful little tropical island called Christmas Island, just off the north coast of Australia. So we used a structured decision-making approach here. We brought in the national park managers. So Judy there was standing on a chair trying to get an overview of the problem, and Dion decided he was going to stand on the table to get an even better overview of the problem. So our decision makers were heavily engaged with the process, physically engaged with the process. And it's messy. This was just our attempt to define the problem. So you can see that the definition of the problem is actually very difficult. We had a whole bunch of threatened bird species along the top, and then we had a whole bunch of different species interacting with them. There are feral chickens. These are big wild chickens that roam around Christmas Island eating giant centipedes and things like that. It's a bizarre ecosystem. The giant centipedes hang off the tops of caves and they catch bats and eat them. We have wolf snakes in the system, which are big predatory snakes. And then there's a whole bunch of threatened bird species. Some of them are endemic to Christmas Island. They occur nowhere else. So we'd spent a lot of time actually trying to work out what the national park managers wanted here. What they wanted was not to kill the cats. That's not the aim. And this is a mistake that's made very often with invasive species or pest species management. The aim is not to remove something from an ecosystem. It's actually to achieve a broader objective than that, a whole of ecosystem objective. So we identified a bunch of species that they wanted to conserve, and we sort of prioritized the conservation needs of those species. And then we defined some actions, and some of those actions involved removal of the cats, removal of the rats, removal of cats and rats together. And then we ran some models to try and work out what the consequences of those actions might be. And we were looking for positive benefits on the species we cared about. And it didn't matter how many cats or rats we had to kill to get there in our model. That wasn't the objective. That was a means to an end. So by looking at the problem from the whole of ecosystem approach, we were able to come up with better solutions than just the sort of knee-jerk remove one species, remove another species. So another example, again from the pest world. So these are pest plants, weeds in New Zealand. What we're showing here is estimating the costs of doing a management action. So here it's removal of trees, and there's two ways we can do this. We can attach a double chain between two tractors, drive it through a field, and it rips up the trees as it goes. Queensland farmers are very innovative in their methods for dealing with things they don't like. In this case, we want to get rid of these trees because they're causing massive ecosystem damage through water use and biodiversity loss. You can also spray them with a helicopter from the air. Aerial foliar application of herbicide. And we were looking at how effective these methods were on the population growth rate of the trees. That's what's on the y-axis there. So the more effective it is, the lower we want that to be. And we also compared that with the cost of using these. And you can see there that double chain ploughing is relatively cheap, but not very effective. You don't get much of a reduction in your population growth rate. Aerial foliar herbicide application is very effective, but it's very expensive. So that's where our trade-offs come in, the costs and benefits of doing things. Now, it's not all about cost. This is some work we did recently on 14 different weed species. We collected information on their population dynamics. We modeled different kinds of management. We asked managers what they perceived the most effective kind of management to be. And we compared that with, so that we ranked these management strategies according to what the managers told us they thought was effective, according to what the costs were, according to what the modeled efficacy was, whether it changed the population dynamics or not, and then the cost effectiveness. So all I want you to take away from this figure is our three management strategies, herbicide, grazing, and mowing, hit very different metrics. So there's lots of dimensions on which these costs and benefits can be measured. And it's up to the decision makers what they really care about. So if you were very concerned about cost, you would choose the cheapest option, which is grazing. And if you were very concerned about efficacy, you would choose herbicide. So it depends what you really care about. Showing people the options and what it does to the things that they might care about really helps them to make decisions. So we've used this approach really effectively in lots of different papers, predicting species distributions for conservation decisions, prioritizing management actions for invasive populations of 14 species. I was asked to write a perspective for science on sort of whole of ecosystem effects of doing these kinds of management actions, and looking at the side effects of that. Also worked on looking at optimal management strategies for connected networks of pests and diseases. And we could also apply some of the same methods to conserving connected populations as well. So we've had a lot of fun and hard work in looking at these kinds of management options and how we can use structured decision-making to help that. However, that's the management to natural capital stocks boxes covered. We can see how we can use management to change the biological components of ecosystems. But there's a really big problem here if we want to take this ecosystem services natural capital approach, and that's understanding the links between natural capital, the living organisms that we have on the planet, and the services they provide to us. This is the really hard bit. And this is where fundamental ecology, rather than applied ecology, really comes to the fore. So, this is a broad overview of my work, recent work in this area, which is looking at connections between environmental conditions. So in particular, we're interested in looking forward into the future and how climate will change how natural capital operates. We link this to life history strategy, which is your way of making your living in the world if you're a plant or animal species. I'll give you an example in a minute. And we're interested in how traits, I've shown some leaf traits and seed traits here, so how big your leaves are, how tough your leaves are, how big your seeds are, how that affects your life history strategy, and ultimately the population performance. So do we expect these populations to increase or decrease under changed environmental conditions? Or how can we use traits to predict which kinds of species will increase or decrease? This is real fundamental, hardcore ecology. Okay, so to illustrate life history reproduction, I think there's giggles from the front row here, because this is my family, a couple of generations back. So the rather severe-looking woman in the front row is Ellen and her husband Jeremiah, is that right? Yep, great. They're my great-grandparents. Right behind Jeremiah is Michael, who's my grandfather and my dad's father. And Michael and the rest of his brothers and sisters they're all siblings. So my great-grandmother and great-grandfather had a lot of children. We currently don't really know how many, but there's, I think, 14 or 15 in that picture anyway. So a lot, a fair few. Good Irish Catholic stock, obviously, a few brothers and nuns scattered around there. The ones not in the picture are probably still on the mission somewhere. So that's one life history strategy. That's a lot of reproduction. So you can choose to have many. So life history strategy is all about how long you live for, how fast you grow, how many babies you have. My own life history strategy is somewhat more restrained. I have 2 kids. And I've made, there's obviously some trade-offs there. You can't produce that many nature and science papers if you have 15 children. I'm happy with my choice. So that's what life history strategy is all about. And what we've been doing is we've been collecting information on plant and animal populations. And a postdoc in my lab, Rob Salguero Gomez, has collected these, and it's been a really great open science project. So this idea of collecting information from the literature and providing it back out to the scientific community freely available in these 2 databases. So the graph shows time along the x-axis. These are studies of population dynamics of plants and animals. And we now have over 1,000 species of plants and 1,000 species of animals in these databases for which we know their growth, reproduction, survival, shrinkage in the wild, in their natural habitat. This is an amazing resource. We haven't up until now had all this together in one spot for so many species. This enables us to do some really exciting things. And this is a paper that came out just in January this year, where we reclassified plant life histories according to the theory that's already known, this fast-slow continuum. Species which grow fast don't live a long time. Species that grow slowly live a long time. That's the fast-slow continuum. And prior to now, people have considered that reproduction also falls along that continuum. So you live fast, that means you grow fast, you don't survive very long, and you produce lots of babies. And the other end of the other extreme is you grow slowly, you live a long time, and you don't produce very many babies in one go. But we showed that for plants anyway, that the reproductive strategy is completely decoupled from the growth and survival strategy. So we now have a 2-dimensional view of life history strategy. Each of these points up here is a different species. I think we've got about 480 species up there, everything from trees all the way through to tiny little herbs. And we're able to put them in this space and say the ones at the top produce lots of babies, the ones at the bottom don't produce very many babies, not very often, and then the ones over here don't live very long. The ones over here live a long time, so your giant redwoods lie over there, thistles and some other weedy things lie over here. So this is super exciting, and we're now working to try and understand the link between traits and life history strategy. So can we predict where in this life history space a species will fall according to what traits it has, how big its leaves are, how fast it assimilates, how fast its metabolism is, all that kind of thing. And this is what I've received Science Foundation Ireland funding for recently. We're also working on this end. Anna Chergo and Sean Coutts in my lab are working on the links between environmental conditions all the way through to life history strategy and population performance. And we're funded by the European Commission through FP7 and Horizon 2020 to do that work. So one thing that we noticed when we gathered all these data together in life history strategy was that we have great between-species information, but within a species, we can't really get a handle on how the environment affects population dynamics, because most species are just studied from a few locations in the world. So this graph here shows the mean distance between populations of plants in our database. You can see that most of the populations within a species are lying within just 5 or 10 kilometers of each other, which gives us very little environmental variance to look at. So that led to this great new project called Plant PopNet. I'm very proud to have the owners of the world headquarters for Plant PopNet in the front row here. My uncle and aunt have the very first Plant PopNet site in North Cork. We now have, I think, 30, 33, 35 sites all around the world, all looking at the same thing. We're choosing to look at one species, Plantago lanceolata. An outline of that is shown here at the bottom. And we're investigating it at the largest spatial extent ever studied for a plant species. That is 16,820 kilometers. So we're extending the x-axis of what we know about plant populations currently all the ways out here by looking at populations in Brisbane and North Cork, which coincidentally happens to be where I moved from and to Ireland anyway. So we're able to then look at these populations and their performance under a really wide range of environmental conditions. Shown here is the mean temperature Plantago grows at, and the precipitation, the rainfall in the different places it grows in. And the red dots are all of the sites that we have all over the world. So this will really enable us over the next 3 to 5 years to get a really good understanding of how the environment affects population dynamics and life history strategy, and will really help us with interpreting those cross-species patterns that we see. Okay, so what about humans? Where do they lie in all this? So I've spent a lot of time thinking about the ecology of populations. I've spent a lot of time thinking about how humans manipulate populations. And more recently, I started thinking a bit more deeply about what it is about humans that changes the ecology of these places. Because in the future, we won't be able to think about natural ecology. We won't be able to study places that don't have human influence. So we desperately need to understand how the most dominant species on the planet, the biggest ecosystem engineer there is out there, we desperately need to understand how humans are influencing things. So this is the part of the talk which is about the landscapes of the future. And a few years ago, I really started to think about, okay, I've got a tenured position now, which means I can't be sacked. Unless I say something really terrible in the next 10 minutes. So this gives you a tremendous opportunity to really think about what it is that I want to do with my career that will make a difference. You no longer have to think about where the next grant is coming from or where the next paper is coming from. You get to sit back and really think about what is it that I deeply want to do with my science. And for me, it's understanding these landscapes of the future, understanding how these landscapes are going to look under climate change and with increased human influence. So that's a very lofty goal. My first step along that path was to start to think about, well, what do I know? What can I bring to the table here? And what is it about my experiences that will be valuable? And what I was thinking was that invasive species, which I know and have studied for couple of decades now. That's my area of expertise. What can we learn about the movement, the impacts, and the management of invasive species? How can that help us to predict what's going to happen to all the plant species that will be moving, contracting in range, and expanding in range with climate change over the next few decades? So we wrote, together with my postdoc, Paul Kaplat, we wrote this discussion paper, and this sort of set me off down the road of thinking about how the environment affects plant populations. And this also led me into another hornet's nest of controversy. So this was a paper, not one of mine. This was written by Mark Davies a few years ago, about the time when I started thinking about what we can learn from invasive species, which basically said that we don't need to consider invasiveness anymore. We don't need to consider where a species comes from. All species are the same. We just need to consider their impact in the ecosystems in which they're in. So knowing whether a species is native or not native to an area tells you nothing really about its ecology or how it will operate. And that led to an absolute slew of other papers from the same side and other sides, basically saying the Anthropocene could raise biological diversity. This may not be such a bad thing. We don't need to consider non-native species as all bad anymore. There might be some good in them. And then there was counter-arguments from the other side, misleading criticisms of invasion science. And then another call for the end of invasion biology. They really wanted to hammer the nails in the coffin down. And then my all-time favorite paper title, which is A Call for an End to Calls for the End of Invasion Biology. Oh, God. You know, it was just and I was involved in editing and reviewing these papers as they were coming along, and I started getting really cross about the whole argument because it was a lot of heat and no light. One of the problems with invasion ecology is it's very anecdotal. So one side says invasive species are bad, here's an example of a bad invasive species. The other side says, well, here's lots of examples of species that come from are non-native and they don't cause any problems at all. So I thought, right, okay, well, what do we have access to that would shed some light on this? And I'm involved in yet another big international, globally distributed network called NutNet, where we had data from lots and lots of sites all over the world, all doing the same experiment in grasslands. These are 3 sites that I've been involved in. So we've just finished setting up the Slieve Carron site in the beautiful Burren in Ireland. In Burrawan in Australia, which was the first NutNet site I was involved in, and Pinjarra Hills in Australia, which was another one I set up because I just can't get enough of this experiment. Pinjarra Hills is almost entirely exotics. There's a mix of natives and exotics in Burrawan, and Slieve Carron is entirely native dominated, and it's an absolutely gorgeous place to do some field work. So we have very contrasting sites in this network. There's now nearly 100 sites in the whole network. We have examples of native and non-native species in all of the sites in this network, and we thought, well, first things first, let's look at what native and non-native species are actually doing in these sites. So the native species, if we look at this graph here, the native species are in black and the non-native species are in red. The maximum cover in percent is on the y-axis. And what you see across the board is that wherever we see non-native species, the red line, it's always above the black line. Non-native species are much more abundant in the sites than average native abundance. And this is true even when we correct for sample size and all that complicated stats stuff that I'm sure you don't want to know about. And that came out quite recently. So finally we had some good evidence that non-native species are doing something quite different to native species where they occur. Now these just aren't just the problematic species. These are all non-native species. So we saw, but non-native species, they are more abundant, but they're equally abundant in their own native range, because we had information for some of these species, about 26 species in both their native and non-native ranges, and they're pretty much doing the same thing. So they're not changing their behavior when they come into their non-native sites. So for me, this is clear evidence that non-natives are a very biased sample of the native species pool. We are choosing to transport species that will do well in the new environments in which we chuck them into. So the behavior of these novel ecosystems is fundamentally influenced by how humans move species around. This is important because native and non-native species react very differently to fertilization. In fertilized grasslands, native species richness declines, but non-native species richness declines for natives, and non-native, that should say non-native. Oh yeah, that's right, sorry. Oh, I got my natives and non-natives mixed up. Right, native species richness declines, non-native species richness stays the same, and non-native abundance increases. So what we're seeing is the natives are going down and the non-natives are increasing when we fertilize. So I was asked to write a discussion paper about all this, and it was a really cathartic process because I'd been through the whole origins debate as a bystander and getting cross at the sidelines for a long time, and eventually got to add my paper to the pile, where we discussed broadly what does biogeographic origin of species tell us. And we used the information from NutNet, from this broad global data set of species to bring some evidence to the table for that. Okay, so getting close to wrapping up now. So to understand the landscapes of the future, we can't ignore the influence that humans have. We are the most dominant species on the planet. I think that the natural capital framework that I've put up here, where we talk about management of natural capital stocks, and then use ecology, so that's the technology part, and the ecology is then used to work out what effects our management actions are happening, is very important. But we also need to include the human social systems, which drive a lot of the processes in our ecosystems. And finally, I just want to thank everyone here for coming. It's a real pleasure to be able to give a sort of an overview talk like this to an audience of people I love and respect. So thank you all very, very much.